Efimov did something remarkable. He managed to get Russians to watch cricket. Men drinking in pubs across Tiva, Voronezh and Moscow. I don't know, other than Moscow, how you pronounce any of those places. But places in Russia were following the Indian Premier League. Cricket in Russia is not big. In 2019, the Ministry of Sport refused to recognize the game officially. That was eventually overturned, and the ICC allowed Russia membership to play for T20 internationals. They were suspended from that. There is a Moscow Cricket Academy and many expats trying to keep the sport alive. It actually did once thrive there. Cricket was played in St. Petersburg as far back as the 1870s, and matches were regular until the Bolsheviks took over. They decided, for some unknown reason, that cricket was elitist. But the chances are that the blokes in the pubs weren't aware of any of this. They just wanted to gamble on something live in a good time zone for them. So Efimov provided them with the Indian Premier League. Just not the real one. But you can't really tell this story without telling the history of grifting and fraud and money in cricket. It goes all the way back to the start of the Test game.
This is the last knot. My dad told me to say this.
Ted Pooley was supposed to be England's first ever wicketkeeper in the match that is now known as cricket's first ever test. Instead, he was in a Christchurch jail. This weird, random occurrence happened because of an injury that kept him out of the tour matches in New Zealand. Because he couldn't play, Ted Pooley offered to umpire. The problem was that while he was in the middle controlling play, he also bet on the exact same game. Yeah, I think you can see what the problem was there. On top of that, Pooley won a lot of money for those bets, and so the local bookmaker decided that because of this, he shouldn't be paid out. Pooley was arrested for attacking the bookmaker. And this is not a one-off story, it's one of thousands in cricket. At the early part, gambling on cricket was just a huge part of the game. So much so that when it moved from a street and park pastime to a professional sport, the laws were written around gambling. Cricket's original rules were part of an oral tradition. But from 1744, they started to become codified and then eventually written down as laws. And at that point, there were no major cricket organisations, and the Hambledon Cricket Club was the main cricket venue in the world. And in no other way was Hambledon a big deal to anyone. It's not in London, it's not in Manchester, it's not in Birmingham, it's not even on a coast. And in the days before cars, it's not even that close to any of those things. It's just a small village in the south of England. But the games got big there because of the amount of gambling that they allowed in, and what ended up in being a near non-stop festival of elites drinking, betting and watching cricket. And the laws of our game were shaped by this sporting, old-timey, posh Las Vegas. Obviously when it came to the laws, the players were involved, like when Thomas White used a bat the size of the wicket. They obviously had to change the laws at that point. But the model of Hambledon to make money was to get maximum revenue from each match. That meant that the laws and the bookmakers had to kind of form a partnership. And when it comes to money in cricket, we often gloss over these things from the early part of the game's history. We pretend that people played for the love of the sport. But there was always a business around cricket. We just kind of ignored it for a long period of time. Even the early cricket heroes, the amateurs, who loved the game so much that they didn't want to be paid for it, even they were all about money. Unlike other sports, there was no split between the two. There wasn't an amateur competition and a professional competition. Amateurs and professionals would play together. The difference is that the professionals were paid as a job and the amateurs were not. Except many of them were actually paid, often more than the professionals, especially on tours. W.G. Grace was by far the best paid player in cricket, as he should have been, because he's like, what, a mix between Roger Federer, Michael Jordan and Serena Williams. But he was also, to use a phrase of its era, a shamateur. The entire history of cricket is loaded with incredible stories about money. The first time what you would deem as an official Australian team toured England, it was part of a co-op, a collective, so they could all make money. And yet, the sport tries to portray itself as the better sport, literally. But things like the Hambledon Haven, the Oval putting gates up, and the IPL renaming a six for commercial reasons have always existed. Cricket has always been about money. LinkedIn is part of my online writing course because there are so many cricketers and coaches that are on there. But even outside of that, me and a fellow journalist used to play a game with LinkedIn where we tried to guess what job a former Shield player may have based on their playing style. Surprisingly, we were often wrong. You, however, can use LinkedIn for far more important reasons, like creating a job post in minutes. Add the hashtag hiring and off you go. You can try screening questions to find people with the right skills and experiences, because if you're a small business, well, LinkedIn is a large pond. So don't use this terrific platform to see what Graham Vimpani is up to since he's 100 against the West Indies. Instead, visit linkedin.com/Inca, as in Inca, the back half of my podcast, Red Inca, and you can post a job ad for free. Terms and conditions to apply. We currently call Efimov's creation the Fake IPL, but it really should be known as the Mollypaw Premier League in honor of the village that hosted it. And that term, village, obviously has negative connotations in cricket. To refer to someone's game as village is an insult. There's no getting around it though. The Mollypaw Premier League, or let's just go with MPL, was certainly very village. In proper cricket, umpires call wides based on guidelines marked between the crease. It really helps umpires make less of a judgment call. In the MPL, they had little orange cones on the field. Why they didn't use paint, we will never know. There's no way any real league would ever have something like this on the ground. Not only are they clearly trip hazards, they could also stop the ball from travelling further. And you can see this on some of the footage from the MPL that we know is part of the racket. It does show just how random a lot of the cricket is. Like, there is a fielder directly behind the wicketkeeper, where he's supposed to be at slip, but his actual position is basically backstop. You do see this in like children's matches when the kids struggle to stop the balls with the gloves on, or you might see it all the way back on the boundary if you're bowling very short and fast. The bowler is certainly not doing those things, and the fielder is supposed to be at slip. And at this pace, the only way a delivery would make it to slip on the full would be if the batter picked it up and threw it back there. It's quite clear that this fielder just wanted to hide, and good on him. We've all done it. Then you have a look at the keeper, who doesn't have pads on. Now, some modern players do use shin guards under their trousers to give them more flexibility. That doesn't appear to be the case here. Also, the technique of the keeper, it's not good. He doesn't bend at the knees to start on the ground. Instead, he's bent over with his hands near his hips. This is how people keep when they've never played with a real cricket ball before. He also doesn't move as the ball comes down. He's a little bit like a glitching computer game character stuck in the same spot. If the ball is to go down leg side, the slip backstop is just as likely to stop it as he is. But he's also not at the stumps. But neither is he a long way back. I think he can't stand at the stumps because he has no idea how to. But no professional would ever stand in this no man's land. The bowler is clearly not great either. His run-up is 5 paces, which is on the low side for a seamer. He starts wide, immediately comes in towards the stump, and then he goes wide again. He's bowling slow medium pace, and looks like this is the first time he's ever dealt with running past a proper umpire before. Yet his balls do skid off the pitch a little bit, and that's probably because they are bowling on matting. Pakistan and South Africa use matting pitches for their internationals for a very, very long time, but eventually both moved to turf wickets. And in the last 50 years, I can't think of any international matches that have been played on them. That's not to say that they've disappeared entirely. Some associate nations have had to use AstroTurf pitches, especially for the women's game. But almost all cricket that we watch is on real turf. And it has been for a very long time. And you know what else is unlikely? Having a bunch of balls out on the ground. In baseball, this would make sense, although it's doubtful they'd ever be in a pile near the pitcher's feet. But in cricket, where you use one ball for the entire game unless you lose it or break it, why would you need a collection of balls as a very obvious trip hazard right by the bowler? There is also the very nice touch that players wear specially made coloured cricket clothing but still have white pads on. If you are going to hire a bunch of enthusiastic but essentially club cricketing farmers to fake your league, at least pony up for a few more dollars for coloured pads. I think my favourite moment is when the ball is lofted in the air. Always a moment of great intensity in a cricket match. Oh, he skied that! Will it go for 6? Be caught, land safe. You often see the tension on the faces of the batters and the bowlers. But from our MPL friends, you see a gentle walk in the park from one end to the other. And then the ball gets softly passed back to the bowler. Did it bounce? Was it dropped? We will never know. The MPL is a whodunit, on and off the field. But on betting, I want to go back to 1948. the Australian opener Sid Barnes decided to back himself at Lord's. Literally. He placed a bet on the fact that he would make 100 in that test, and then he went out and he did it. Over 30 years later at Headingley, England were getting crushed by Australia, and the bookmakers at the ground offered the comedy odds of 500 to 1. Two Australian players, Dennis Lillee and Rod Marsh, put on what they called a joke bet of £15. This was the 905th test match. In the previous 904, only once had a team overcome a follow-on. That was in the 1800s. But that is what, of course, England would go on to do at Headingley. At that point, it was most probably the biggest comeback in Test cricket history. That test has a movie and a book about it. And the bet is often laughed off as just Aussies being Aussies. Yeah, mate, just having a bit of a bet. No drama. It is worth noting that while most people think of it that way, England's Graham Dilley, who made a handy 50 down the order as Ian Botham was swinging away, once said, "The bet just put an element of doubt in my mind, even though I knew nothing dodgy had happened." For the record, Lillee took 3 wickets in a poor bowling display and was the 3rd top scorer with the bat, so make of that what you will. But at that time, and also in 1948, there's no doubt that the bets were just seen as having a bit of fun. And there are certainly many other stories of players making bets in cricket in their own games on their own performance, especially as for so long and in so many different countries, bookmakers were inside the ground. But there's also been a constant dark side with that sort of thing. William Lambert was an incredible batter and the second biggest star in the game, and in 1817 he was the first player to make 200s in a first-class match. The same year he was found guilty of match fixing. This happened at Lord's. And it was really after Headingley in 1981 that betting on cricket went from a laugh to outright corruption. Salim Malik, Hansi Cronje and Mohammad Azharuddin were all suspended for match fixing related issues. And these were not just respected senior players, but had been captains of their national sides at times. And from that match fixing cluster, the cloud never really went away. It probably peaked in 2010 when an English tabloid caught Mohammad Asif, Mohammad Amir and their Pakistani captain Salman Butt. That spot fixing at Lord's was 193 years after William Lambert. I think it's fairly naive to believe not much went on in between. These days, corruption in cricket is much more confusing because it's such an international sport. For instance, the ICC believed that Salman Butt was fixing way before he was caught. But they are not Interpol, and working out how to prove it was very tough. I have met people who believe that at the 2007 World Cup in the West Indies, Salman Butt was already on the take. But think about that. He is in the West Indies and he's a Pakistani player. He was probably using international phones, maybe US phones, English phones and Indian phones. If you also add up all the islands he went through in the West Indies, we're now talking about what, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 jurisdictions? It's very hard to catch these people. And while most cricket nations are obviously Commonwealth members, and traditionally certainly so, these countries are not that much alike. Gambling is illegal in many cricket nations, yet in Melbourne, the home of the first test, there is a holiday for a horse race. So proud of my people. And yet at the same time, betting is obviously mostly illegal across the subcontinent. Sri Lanka regulated theirs in 2010, though it should be said that it seemed to be fairly open within the country before that. But India, Bangladesh and Pakistan all don't allow betting on cricket. Nepal is the same. Afghanistan has interesting rules when it comes to online gambling, which I don't quite understand. But I think we can safely say that the Taliban is probably not going to be pro-gambling on sport. But the problem is, even if you have a law against it, you won't actually stop people from betting. Prohibition does not work when it comes to gambling. It has always been an open joke that most US sports fans betted for generations despite not being legally able to do it in the vast majority of the country. Sports fans, and certainly cricket ones, are going to gamble. No law is going to stop that. So that means that cricket is a sport built around betting while having this extensive illegal gambling system behind it. Even the legal betting companies are fed up with the illicit markets that are often controlled by organised crime. The legal entities help the ICC and cricket boards with irregular markets that could come from fixing, because they also don't want to be ripped off. And so all of this creates a bizarre situation where this sport grew on the back of gambling. And as it did, it meant that it found new locations in the world that didn't allow betting. And the combination of these two worlds seems to have created a near perfect sport for constant gambling corruption. I've mentioned this before, but there's a great episode of Aaron Sorkin's Sports Night that discusses a fictitious cricket event of a bowler taking all 10 wickets in an innings. Part of the running joke in the entire episode is that no one knows anything about cricket in America, But there is also this great visual gag, which is just a bunch of random images shown on a screen in a short period of time. Bowler, batter, fielder, crowd, and boundary, all juxtaposed like an Eisenstein montage. And think back to the cricket that you watch. Let's say a leg by that ends up going for a boundary. Think about what the screen will show you. Someone will get hit, and then the ball will be on the grass. A bowler will be frustrated as two men run past him in opposite direction. The ball hits the rope, the crowd cheer, an umpire does sign language before standing on one leg, and two grown men then fist bump with gloves on. Much of what we see on TV is a collection of images that only a cricket fan could make any sense of. The visual language of cricket is so bizarre. And even just a few years ago, cricket was almost exclusively a big TV production, wasn't it? Hugely expensive long lens cameras aiming down at the cricketers, with many other smaller cameras around the ground picking up the action. Then streaming happened. And with that came the ability for anyone with a stable internet connection and a camcorder to show their game to the world. It probably starts with first class matches like the Sheffield Shield in Australia and county cricket in the UK. But soon, a lot of cricket had some kind of one camera setup for streaming. What follows that is places like Cricket District, and so then club cricket starts to do it. So places like Cricket District start popping up, essentially showing clips from very funny club moments. We also see the European Cricket League, a tournament that live streams club matches from Europe to around the world. It wasn't that long ago that cricket used to look very professional when it was made by a big TV network. And now it is increasingly one handycam and maybe a couple of other angles to follow the ball. Yes, the look of the NPL is bad. But in today's world, it doesn't stick out as much as it once would have. They had more than one camera, helmed by professionals, hired video graphics designers, and had a commentator, who was impersonating Harsha Bhogle, to tell the punters to bet and also what was happening in the game. When the ball was hit up, you'd get a sky shot and the umpire calling a six. They ensured never to get too close to the players, lest the bettors work out that they were fake, which was probably unnecessary detail, but even still. There are still obvious things that make the footage to a cricket fan look very, very unconvincing. But to people watching that weren't, if you know nothing of the game, the players are out there wearing colours, there is a camera, graphics, the ball's moving around, and an upbeat man with a pleasant demeanour is calling the action. Clearly, that was enough. And remember, when it comes to betting, people do wager on weird things, like the animated horse racing programs that are clearly fixed beforehand. This at least had humans and a camera angle that replicated what cricket looks like, or a good enough facsimile. But while we're talking about cricket on TV, let's talk about the person who kind of changed how it looked for us in the first place. There were two rich media moguls in Australia in the 1970s. One went on to conquer the entire media world, and his life is now fictionalized in a HBO drama called Succession. The other was Kerry Packer. These two men inherited sizable businesses from their fathers, but while Rupert Murdoch went large, Kerry Packer stayed at home and just dominated the Australian TV market. But as powerful as Packer was, he still had to handle the local bureaucracy, and one of those regulations was to show a large percentage of Australian-made TV shows. It's actually now why there are so many popular Australian children's shows worldwide, like Bananas in Pyjamas, The Wiggles, and Bluey. These are cheap to make and easy to produce in bulk. That's what Kerry Packer wanted. And as a huge cricket fan, he knew how many hours the game could take up on TV. So after trying to buy the rights legally and being rebuffed because he couldn't broadcast nationally and the boards also liked their deal with the ABC, he just started his own league, World Series Cricket. A completely made-for-TV product that was tweaked to make it sexier and, crucially, played in prime time rather than the middle of the day. Packer essentially bought the majority of Australia's best cricketers and then did the same with other teams like the West Indies. But he cherry-picked from the best players around the world, paying them huge amounts of money. Richard Austin was a struggling West Indian player in and out of the team. He would receive $74 for appearing in a test match, and he only played in 2 of them. Packer gave him a 2-year, $20,000 contract. Despite the fact that Packer loved cricket and did want to broadcast it, he didn't want to run the game, so Cricket Australia eventually gave him the TV rights to end the conflict, and Packer left the game in, I suppose, an official sense. Richard Austin, who I mentioned before, wasn't just paid by Packer though. He also received another payment of $100,000 to go on a tour. Sadly, that one was to play in apartheid South Africa on what is now called within cricket the Rebel Tours. Unofficial Australian, English, Sri Lankan and West Indies teams were sent over there as professional cricketers during the sporting bans. They were playing for a cricket-starved crowd because South Africa had been ostracised from the sport. Obviously, politically, what they were doing was horrendous. But these players were easy pickings, just as they had been for Packer, because they were paid terrible money. Cricket had good finances, but that money never trickled down, which allowed for the players to be bought off. See also match fixing. The entire thing would happen again with the unofficial Indian Cricket League, buying up many of the biggest names in cricket. And then a few years later with a failed World Test League. The majority of cricketers had never been paid anywhere near their true worth, considering what the game actually makes, meaning that they are almost constantly able to be bought. That's not quite the case with the NPL, which was not professional cricketers. But the NPL was supposed to run for a long time. The land had been leased for a year, and the scam was to last at least that long. There were agents in Russia and India working behind the scenes, and at the Indian end, it was looked after by a man who used to work in an electronics store who'd lost his money on a buffalo dairy business. There were farmers and unemployed people who were recruited as players, and they were paid around 400 rupees a day. And it would be unfair to say that they couldn't play cricket, but clearly they were of an incredibly low level. And we were seeing them after they were trained how to look like professional players, including proper techniques, and even the umpires had classes. A local farmer was offered more money than he'd ever make in a year from crops for the rental of his land, and they turned his field into a cricket ground. There was obviously fake crowd noise that was piped in on the PA system that they had bought. Messages on what was to happen next on the ground were sent to the umpires, who had walkie-talkies, just like in real life, except this time they were directing the play to milk the gamblers. Here's the other weird thing. Even the people betting were trained. An online course to explain how to bet on cricket was made by the NPL founders. They did more work than Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams. After the first raid, 4 people were arrested, but many others have been named, and it's quite clear that this is an ongoing and very large investigation. The original charges were for criminal conspiracy. Many people believe the Lord's press box looks like a UFO, but it was the helicopter that landed behind it that was more out of this world. Inside was Alan Stanford, a billionaire who claimed to be related to the Stanford University family. He'd splashed money all around the Caribbean and was even given a knighthood. He also did a similar thing to Kerry Packer, essentially creating a new cricket tournament, but this time with a little bit of assistance from the Cricket West Indies board. And like Packer, he wanted to sex cricket up with big money prizes and black bats. But the reason he was at Lord's was to confirm a partnership with the English Cricket Board for a match between them and his Stanford All-Stars. The winner would take home $20 million, which he showed in a big plastic box at Lord's. Sadly, the money in the box was fake, twice. The imitation bills he showed were very similar to his own fraudulent wealth on the back of a massive Ponzi scheme. Currently, Alan Stanford is serving a 110-year sentence. That was an official league though. But there's been unofficial ones as well, like the UVA T20 League that was going to have Tilakrat Ulshan, Hafiz Maharoof and Ajanta, your favourite Sri Lankan players, all during lockdown. A host of major Sri Lankan companies were sponsoring as emails from Sri Lankan cricket officials were sent around promoting this event. The major problem really was that none of these players were involved. Oh, and also it wasn't in Sri Lanka. The police found this league in Mahali. The entire thing was a scam tournament with Indian players pretending to be Sri Lankan. It was organised by a fixing and gambling syndicate who were as hard hit by COVID as everyone else was. That happened in 2020, but just a few weeks ago there was also the Big Bash Punjab T20, a tournament played in Meerut. Some of India's best Ranji players were involved. The games were live streamed on YouTube, and cricket fans around the world could watch and enjoy. Except, yeah, again, it was another scam. In this case, looks like from the same group who did the NPL. Police now suspect that there is a widespread criminal conspiracy across many different parts of India with these fake leagues attached to them. Cycling, athletics and baseball all had major scandals as people cheated to win. Again and again in cricket, we seem to cheat to lose. In other sports, the bettors just waged on them. In cricket, gamblers help build our game. Many still call it the gentleman's game, promoting their all-white clothes and the breaks for tea. But at its core, if you are paying attention, cricket has always been the grifter's game. What happened in Mollypore might not be the real IPL, but it is the true story of cricket.